and a long-term problem with respect to provision of factor VIII concentrate in 84, 85 and successive years. Both of these have a common factor, which is the failure to open the plasmapheresis centre in Lancaster. And you'll have seen from the earlier documents, expectations were pinned upon the opening of that it would improve the situation in terms of supply, but that didn't happen.
Factor VIII, exposing the contaminated blood scandal.
We'll look at such data as we have about usage, but what we see is essentially the now familiar pattern of commercial concentrates being purchased to make up shortfalls because of insufficient supplies of NHS factor. You may want to note one reference, which is to a letter from Dr. Wensley in 1990. The reference is NHBT 0018289. I don't need to put it up on screen, Shomik. But he there essentially sets out a concern that the region had been underfunded for years. Whilst we're getting that, we'll be able to see from this document that as reference centre directors, Dr. Delamore and or Dr. Wensley, in due course, were privy to the reports and studies that were being undertaken. So this, by way of example, is a written report that was prepared for the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting in April of 1971, attended by Dr. Delamore. And it's a study of haemophilia A and Christmas disease patients. And we can see, I won't go through the detail of it, but first page reference to a study of the incidence of transfusion hepatitis and inhibitors, two most alarming complications of treatment. Halfway down the page, transfusion hepatitis is thought to be a virus infection transmitted to the recipient by the donor plasma. There's every reason to suppose that the virus is contained in the various protein fractions used to treat haemophilia and Christmas disease. And then the next paragraph, the danger of infection can be calculated and will be related to the number of donors used to make the material used for treatment or the number of donor exposures. If large pools of plasma are used to make therapeutic concentrates, the theoretical danger of infection will be increased. If we go on to page 9, this treatment is known to carry two main hazards. One, the transmission of infective hepatitis. Hepatitis transmission must be related to the number of donor exposures of the patients. This number will increase with the use of tried concentrates made from large pools of donors.
Well, the sentence perhaps deserves highlighting three lines down. The problem in recommending an increased manufacture of these lies in the possible increase in hepatitis and antibodies.
Yes.
So the link there appears to be, theoretically at any rate, between the size of the pool
Precisely.
And the risk of hepatitis.
Yes. And actually, if we look at the very bottom of that same page, the incidence of jaundice in treated patients must increase with the number of donor exposures, and the number of donor exposures must increase using concentrates derived from large pools. And then there is an aspiration that a method will be found to remove Australia antigen from concentrated materials. It's 1971. If we then look...
Do you read in the last two sentences there a call, or at least a view, which may be the same, that something ought to be done about inactivating the virus?
In the last sentence, yes. Absolutely.
And this is in 1971. Okay. And it's before any commercial concentrate made from even larger pools is licensed.
Yes, that's a little later on.
Well, that comes in 73, I think.
Yes. We can see there, Department of Clinical Haematology, University of Manchester, current topics in haemophilia, proceedings of the symposium held in Manchester on September the 14th, 1982, edited by Dr. Wensley. If we go to the next page, we'll see this was sponsored by ARMA. We wish to thank ARMA Pharmaceuticals for making a generous financial contribution towards the cost of the symposium and this publication. If we go on 2 pages, just noteworthy for the foreword by Professor Bloom, He says these are exciting times in the haemophilia world, and this, unfortunately, true to form, new hazards are appearing on the horizon, including the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The impact of these will no doubt feature in our next symposium. So that's Professor Bloom's observations. Clinical risks associated with replacement therapy may be overstated and are certainly outweighed by the need to treat the haemophiliac by the rapid replacement of his deficient clotting factor. Now, sir, one question that you may wish to consider in due course is whether that suggestion that the clinical risks may be overstated, and that leads then to the title of the published article, of which I think Dr. Wensley was a co-author, is actually consistent with the text of what's set out in the body of the paper and the findings from other biopsy studies.
Well, taken out of context, at any rate, it's difficult to understand how that fits with something in the region of 50% of people who've been treated for 10 years in an infection which the assumption of the paper is it is associated with the replacement therapy, can be described as overstated, unless one knows what particular statements he's referring to.
Quite.
But if it's possibly a slow process, and possibly 10 years since, one of the interesting things that go through my mind as you were speaking is the earlier report showing that there hadn't been, that the cohorts of those treated by cryoprecipitate in 1971, presumably for a few years, because cryoprecipitate wouldn't have been available until 65, 66, showed no particular evidence of an incidence of hepatitis over and above that of the usual population. Here it's assumed that there certainly is an association, and so we start off with the basis that having concentrate can cause and does cause a hepatitis, and the hepatitis in 50% of the cases where there's been a biopsy, query why the cases are selected for study, are chronic active hepatitis as it is understood at the time.
Yes.
And in a few cases, cirrhosis. Yes, it's taken out of context. This is not an easy paragraph to understand.
It's not, and of course it then translates into the publication, which we see at PRSE 302564, liver disease and haemophiliacs, an overstated problem, ? The way in which Dr. Gunson puts it at various points of his commentary on the plaintiff's statement of claim in the litigation. So here he says, during 1982, it was not, in my view, proven conclusively that factor VIII concentrates were the cause of AIDS contracted by haemophiliacs. And then he quotes a later presentation by Dr. Peter Jones. So the terminology there, proven conclusively, obviously raises the question of whether that was the right question to ask. Just further down from that paragraph, he says, the first case of transfusion-associated AIDS was reported in 1983 in an infant transfused in December 1982, and this will be referred to later in the statement. So that's the San Francisco baby case.
Just if you go back a moment to, that's it. The reference there to what Peter Jones had to say refers to the MMWR, which is written by the Centre for Disease Control, reporting the infections in 3 men with haemophilia. And it says the possibility of a viral etiology was thought less likely than an immune response to the constant barrage of extraneous denatured protein involved in treatment. That's not actually, is it what the, or have I got this wrong, what the MMWR actually said?
No, I'd read that as him saying that's what Dr. Jones was saying.
Well, but it appears to be a quote which attributes it to the, or could be read as attributing it to the Centre for Diseases Control, because they seem to be, my understanding, quite clear that they thought it was more likely to be viral.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And then he says this: the first proven case of transfusion-transmitted AIDS was reported in 1983 in an infant given a transfusion of blood and products in December 1982.
Well, it was actually reported on the 10th of December 1982.
It was in the MMWR. Yeah. This is on a slightly different topic, but it may assist in when you consider what response could or should have been made to the AIDS crisis. So this is Dr. Wensley writing in June of 1988, and if he's talking about a problem in which the world supply of factor VIII has dried up, and so there's a shortage of factor VIII. And if we go further down the page, please, Seamus, he says this: how will we in the Northwest weather the crisis? And then he talks about the hope that in the Northwest they'll be self-sufficient. And then he says this: we hope that we will have enough freeze-dried factor VIII available to continue home treatment in 1988 for all patients who treat themselves. But a temporary reversion to cryoprecipitate use for certain home treatment patients has to be considered a possibility. A handful of non-emergency operations may have to be postponed and carried over to 1989. So you'll see, sir, that in 1988, in response to a worldwide shortage of factor VIII, Dr. Wensley's contemplating a temporary reversion to cryoprecipitate for home treatment and the deferral of non-emergency operations. And that may give rise to the question of if that's a step that can be taken in response to shortage in 1988, are those steps that could have been taken in response to a real risk of infection in the earlier part of the 1980s.
Factor 8. Exposing the contaminated blood scandal